So I first of all want to do our acknowledgement of country. As an organisation committed to reconciliation, we start by acknowledging the well-known people of the Darug Nation on whose lands we meet today and pay our respect to their elders past, present and future. We wish to express our gratitude that we share these lands today, our sorrow for some of the costs of that sharing, and our hope and belief that we can move to a place of equity, justice and partnership together. Come on in. So I also want to acknowledge that this is a big morning, isn't it? So I think we've just had this announcement. It's hard to have just switch gears, you know, because I guess we might have liked a bit of time to process that, or that might be still in our minds as we move through the morning. And yet we're about to have another important topic. So by lunchtime we'll be really, but we're all up to that, aren't we? We're the sort of organisation that can have a few different things going on at the same time. So, but I just want to acknowledge there's that pressure, I think, and some stress and some processing that needs to happen. So I'd also like to say welcome to everybody, and that it's really important that as business leaders that you're all here to be part of this conversation. There's an ongoing conversation about ICT in this organisation, and this is part of that conversation, but it also kind of indicates perhaps another start gun going off, which we can consider a bit later today. And so before I say a bit more about that, I also just want to acknowledge that we have Marilyn Slay and Barry Westlake here. So Barry's on our RACE board, the board that manages Radiant. Most people know about Radiant, may not know the RACE terminology, our social enterprise. And it's really important that, you know, he's here to hear about the broader organisation and what we're up to. And Marilyn, of course, is the chair of that board and also an NSW board member. And so we particularly welcome them to this conversation. The reason that we're doing this, perhaps if I can just paint a bit of a context. Come on in, Sonia. You like to make a big
great interest
statement. We've had, of course, a long-standing conversation. Certainly, I've only been part of it for 18 months, but it's beyond that, talking about how digital tools will enhance our business strategy. And so that percolates in a range of ways over probably, it's always part of our conversation, but I think in the last 18 months, we've been having some different or heightened conversations about that. And in that mix of those conversations has been an ICT strategy developed under Jill's leadership, with Mark strongly heading that strategy. And so anything we do from here fits into that strategy. And so we can talk about that, and that will be an unfolding conversation. So while we've made some gains, we're still trying to work out what is it that we want to do as an organisation to embrace digital tools. What does that even mean? We use all of these terms, and even as I've talked to various people, it's hard to know what terms to, well, certainly for me, before I get out of my depth. You know, I use a term and think, is that the right term? Do I even know what I'm talking about? You know, I lose confidence very quickly. And so even as we've floundered around together trying to work out what do we mean about a sort of contemporary edge in relation to digitisation, we need to get onto common ground. We need to work out what is our narrative about this, what are our goals and ambitions. And I think to get us there, we might need some new people and some new ideas, not because we don't have fabulous people in this organisation, but because we need other people to help those of us who don't know enough, and I count myself in that category. So I'm interested in learning. In our work with Radiant, we've come across some very interesting people. Being an online product, it's taken us more into these conversations, and one of the people that we've met is Jono, who I'm going to introduce to you today, who's generously come to speak to us. And even just having conversations with him, and I had a conversation with him at the Tamworth RSL Club over a wine. Are you okay,
great
Dave?
Conversations around digital.
That's right. And Jono probably just thought he was having a chat with some random person, but I really thought, wow, this is someone who knows a whole lot of stuff that I don't know, and that I'd like to know more. I was interested and thirsty to talk to him. So he had a much bigger impact on me than I'm sure I did on him. But that's why he's here, because I think he's had a similar impact in conversations with David and Scott, and so hoping he can be part of disrupting our thinking. I've invited him to disrupt us, be open to being bold. So that doesn't mean that I endorse everything he says, because I don't even know what he's going to say. It's a wild ride for us all. But it is to say, let's just be open to other possibilities and how other people do things, and then see what we make of it. But I hope that this might be the beginning of a series of conversations we have with speakers and some fresh insights. So I'll just tell you a bit about Jono. So he was a founding member of Reach Out when it was launched in 1998 as the first digital mental health service in the world, and has gone on to become one of the most passionate advocates for the mental health of young people. You're about to say, talk about it. It's going to say
evacuate now.
That can't be right. It's not an emergency. Let's decide it's not an emergency. So he spent the early part of his career developing and leading the Reach Out service before establishing Reach Out in Ireland in 2009. So since his appointment as the CEO...
Attention everybody, I apologise, that was
so you should.
a test.
Now,
I had to run another test for approximately 20 seconds. I apologise for any inconvenience.
So, I'm just going to speak quickly. Since his appointment of Reach Out in 2010, Reach Out has gone on to become the digital entry point to the mental health system for young people and their parents, and is now accessed by over 1.5 million Australians.
Evacuate now.
You deal well with disruption.
I can cope. I'm ploughing on. So, a lot of the reasons...
Evacuate now. Emergency.
It's that kind of day. So...
Attention everybody, thank you very much for your time.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. Thank you. That people that use the service, young people that use the service, use it for things like exam stress, relationship difficulties and suicidal thoughts. So by 2020, the goal is for Reach Out to help a further 1 million people per year. Jono is also the Director of Mental Health Australia and the Foundation for Alcohol Research and Education. He's co-chair of the Telstra Technology and Wellbeing Roundtable, member of the Federal Department of Health's Digital Mental Health Advisory Committee and the New South Wales Mental Health Commission's Suicide Prevention Advisory Group. And so I'm sure you can hear that he's very well placed to talk about his efforts in this space and for us to be open to what we can learn.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you everybody for taking the time, and this is a momentous day. Right? In some senses, actually, the symbolism is great about dramatic change. Things that we thought were possible become possible very quickly. Although I had an image as that siren was going off of Erica Betts hitting an emergency button around the world's changing, I don't like it, and everyone has to leave and congregate. So, as I was said, my background has for the last 20 years really been at the intersection of technology and mental health. And when I started with Reach Out, I did my undergrad and training up at Macquarie University under a great person called Dr. John Howard, who some of you may know, and then met the founder of Reach Out, Jack Heath, just as I was coming out of university. But before that, and my personal story is my father is a clinical psychologist, and my journey into mental health was part influenced by him and my mum, who was a school principal, but also the tragic loss of a friend of mine to suicide when I was 14. So I made the decision, in a sense, to work in this space around mental health and suicide prevention at 14, and really just had that opportunity to merge it with technology when I met Jack. Now, Jack had an amazing idea, and I've got to credit to the founders of Reach Out. Was really around a time in 1998 where we were on 12.5K dial-up modems and roughly 37,000 Australians were on the internet. As I said to my 8-year-old The internet was something that you had to turn on, and it made a sound.
We were there.
For those of you who've been in your careers, I remember the days where only managers could get access to emails because they were special, and there was one centralised computer. So we have, in many senses, been through these transformational times, probably roughly since that kind of Windows 95 moment where really some of this stuff took off. And it's, in some senses, accelerating. I give you that context because I'm not a technology guy. I'm a human guy. I'm a counselling guy. I grew up with a clinical psychologist. I grew up with a mum who's a principal. But I am also a guy who believes deeply that we have a problem in mental health, which is that we have an industry that's not scalable. That at any given time, roughly 70% of the people who need help get no help at all. And we have a model that simply can't scale quickly enough to meet the demand. We know in terms of the backdrop in mental health that if you look at this on global trends, that there is a mass global movement away from the physical economy to the intellectual economy. What will that mean? It will mean that the productivity benefits of the future will not be about the calluses on people's hands. It'll be how can we monetize what's between our ears, right? And that is true for an investment bank. It's true for Relationships Australia. It's true for Reach Out. We monetize you. We monetize your intellectual output and your ability to communicate with other people, and that's how these businesses operate. So in some senses, we would expect then that mental health challenges will be the challenges of the future, and we've got to think then about how do we deal with that, both in a positive preventative sense, how can we help people be as healthy and well as possible, and in a recovery sense. If you kind of put that backdrop of this sort of growing demand, massive global shifts, if we think we've got a challenge in Australia, I also worked and spent the early part of my career doing human rights work across Indonesia and Cambodia. They have no functioning health system as we would understand it, say, outside Jakarta. So you've got 220 million people coming online and no infrastructure to do a 1 hour, 55-minute style counselling session and get it to scale. So we really have a choice. We have a choice between doing nothing and doing something. And I put that in context because really when people hear disruption and change, what they really kind of hear in many senses is that kind of the limbic system going off saying the world will change and I'll be out of a job, or somehow the things that I value and the things that our clients value will no longer be valued. They're simply choices that we can make, right? But they're not necessarily choices that are baked in. One of the things that we've experienced at Reach Out over the last 20 years, though, is it's not a choice between a counsellor or a computer. It's genuinely a choice between doing nothing and doing something. It's a choice for a young kid in the middle of the night between struggling by themselves or getting access to something. And it's also, for many people, a preferred choice. One of the challenges of our model is that it relies on people talking. So my work and work with suicidal young men was basically working with guys who said, so you're going through a tough time? Yeah, life's pretty shit. So I think you should talk to someone. No, I don't want to do that. And then we go, we do talking stuff. And they go, yeah, I don't want to do that. We go, yeah, but you do talking stuff. And then we go through this pattern where our business model keeps delivering essentially one mode of interaction to improve your mental health, and we force everybody through that one door. And so the choice for the people we serve is you either willingly go through that door or you get nothing. And so one of the great opportunities that we're now seeing in the advancement of mental health is that there will still be a very significant proportion of people who will like that door. That will be their preferred door. There will be still a very significant people who will benefit and actually need to go through that particular door. But what we're seeing now is that there is a great array of opportunities to improve people's mental health. And I think as we see the advances in brain sciences over the next 5 to 10 years, we'll see most of the mental health improvements of our community not come through talking. They will come through things like sleep hygiene. They will come through things like better understanding the relationship between our gut and our eating behaviours and our mental health. They will come through things like the massive expansion, again, of meditation, reflection and self-help. Right? So the question and the real reason I spoke to Elizabeth about some of these things is businesses that adapt very, very quickly to this age are businesses that are not worried about protecting their business model, they're worried about protecting their mission. Businesses who don't adapt are worried about their business model. And so one of the things that we're continually challenged by Richo is saying, is our business model is about providing digital self-help, but our mission is about helping all young people be happy and well. And if I could help more young people be happy and well by changing our business model, I'd do it in a heartbeat. So the challenge of this is actually one where you double down on the things that are important and you willingly give up the things that need to change. And you do it for a higher purpose, which is your mission. Now, each business and each organisation will come at that differently. Right? There is no right or wrong answer, but it is really, that is the core of what we would talk about. What is it that you're willing to examine? And most of the difficulties are not about the difficulties of the people you serve, but the difficulties of us. Things like we've been trained, or I've been trained for 15, 16 years in a particular model, and you're telling me that some of those things, some of that 16 years may no longer be relevant. Yes. That's not a problem for our clients, that's a problem for us. Right? So one of these things that we're starting to see, it's happening across all industries, is essentially that the challenges and opportunities driven by digital disruption and why some folk can adapt more quickly than others are generally those that can go back to a higher purpose and come around that higher purpose, and therefore put on the table things that were previously not put on the table. And those that are willing to recognise the fear that says, actually, I'd much prefer things to remain the same, right? Interestingly, my argument in counselling is that's what we ask our clients to do every day, right? Have you got a higher purpose, which is, do you want your relationship to be better, or do you want to be happy and well? Are you willing to put on the table the things that are holding you back from that? And are you brave enough to look at change, right? So part of my thing in this is far from seeing this as an anathema to our business. I see this as the core to our business, but it actually gives us a great opportunity to put ourselves in the seat of our clients, the people we serve. And I think if we're brave, they're willing to be brave, and they're willing to be responsive. So in terms of some of these things that we'll talk about today, I don't know, does someone need to look back in there?
Oh, yeah.
It'll be really in a couple of parts, and we can have Q&A, we can do it whatever way you want. The first part will be looking at some of these things to do with the environment and why disruption is happening. And what is disruption? It's a word that gets kind of bandied around, kind of like resilience in mental health. Anytime you don't want to talk about things, you use these kind of weird words that mean nothing. Disruption is absolutely one of those weird words. What does it mean? Why are we living in these times? Are we actually in a period of disruption in our industry, right? Because it's certainly happening in other places. Is it happening for us? And if so, what is it? What should we be doing, and how should we be thinking about it? We could probably stop there and have a conversation around some of these things. And then there's another part, which if we get to it, I'm happy to go there, is what can we learn about the culture of some of these new and emerging businesses that have gone from nothing to global scale in 3 to 5 years? How do they actually think about themselves as a business? And what are the lessons that we can learn to adapt pretty quickly to these things? None of that will be about widgets. None of that will be about what you do. To be honest, what you do is your business. I'm not here to advocate integrating reach out. I'm not here to advocate integrating particular tools or anything to do with technology. It's really about laying the scene and about how people can think and approach these things, and then leave it to Elizabeth, you and you as leaders of this business to say, what do we do about it? That's the real challenge. Does that work for everybody?
Yeah.
So before we go on to that, just people interacting a little bit. If there was one question or one thought that I could answer today that would make the next sort of roughly hour and a half really valuable for you, what would that be? So maybe 3 brave volunteers from the audience. One question you might have, we go, actually, I need that answered. Yeah.
What does digital mean broadly?
Sure.
Because a lot of us have got one idea, and a lot of us have got a different idea, and
Sure.
it's perception.
Yep.
So I think that's that change for clinicians who are wedded to their way of doing things, which is the client turns up on time, you take them into a room, they leave at the right time.
Exactly. Well, part of my dad's now well into his 70s, and he does almost exclusive work for the military. He goes, I love it. They always turn up on time. 5 minutes to the hour, they're sitting there very neatly in the uniform, they always leave on time. And they call me sir. It's like a 7-year-old's dream. It's like the world is kind of congregating around his preferred model. So yes, that is the model that has served us very well as a business, and what are some of those things that we need to change? Yes, sorry.
I've got a question, something around the sort of risk of social isolation,
Sure.
that for young people as they get more into the social media and virtual friends and all of
Yep.
this, that alongside of that, the positives
Yep.
and opportunities in this, thinking therapeutically, how do we keep in mind not...
Pick up the good without reinforcing the bad. Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I might actually, I'll start at the digital. What is digital? Digital is not an IT strategy. An IT strategy is about your hardwire and your computers and about kind of productivity. Digital really is about the way, if you think about it, how do we use some of these scalable tools to differently interact in the world, right? At its heart, what digital has done is do two things. Firstly, it's destroyed the value of the expert, right? So a whole bunch of businesses, including counselling, were really premised on that you knew something they didn't, and they had to come through you, and you were the gatekeeper to that knowledge, right? So you told them what teaching is the same. The value of teachers wasn't as much previously about how they taught you to learn, but the stuff they knew that they passed on. So what does digital do? It transfers that to the individual. If you think about it in banking, I sometimes run these and say to some of our youth ambassadors going, do you know it's someone's job to leave work at Friday afternoon, roughly at lunchtime, and do the banking for an afternoon? And they go, what's do the banking? It's like as if it's a saying, right? It's like they stand in the queue, they took lots of cash, they walked down the thing, and then they got a piece of paper, and then they wandered back to the office, and that was the banking. And they literally cannot wrap their mind around that being the model. And so because from their world it was like, well, why wouldn't you just check the app on your balance, right? So what it has done is transfer, and this is really what is digital for me. It's not about the things that we do, but about the transfer in power. The transfer in power from experts who control knowledge to individuals. What does that do for the experts? It means we have to reinvent our businesses adding value, right? I no longer control access. I have to provide a service that means you get value over and above that transaction. So for a teacher is incredibly important, not because they know knowledge. So one young person said to me, what do I need a teacher for? I've got Google, right? Google knows more than my teacher. Yes, that's true, right? But the teacher can tell you and work with you and teach you how to think and how to approach the world. So the value out of the teacher is no longer knowledge as a power base. It's about how do you engage and navigate the world. The power of a real estate agent is no longer about the price of houses in your suburb and giving you the secret magic number that only they know, but about facilitating the house sale, right? So that is really what digital is. It's about the transfer of power to the individual, and about then these gatekeepers of traditional industries starting to shift and add value. Most other people would say digital can also be about tax avoidance, but we can leave that to one side. So I think the second kind of part, I think, which is really important here, is there good and bad? Yes, the short answer is we don't know what the good and bad is, because for young people today, they are living through this disruption, right? It's sort of like asking people that the midst of the Industrial Revolution was moving from an agricultural economy and moving from a farm to the city good. It was like, well, I'm in the middle of it. I don't really know what that is because we're doing the transitionary bit, right? So I think one of the things that I would always say is, there isn't any macro answers yet. There's certainly what we're seeing is some really fascinating positive and negatives to do with digital. So this is, for example, one of the most conservative generations ever. They're using less drugs, less alcohol. They're disinterested in driving because they genuinely are entertained by their mobile phones, right? Young people in some senses are less bored, therefore less need to go down to the park with some cheap wine and hang out with their friends. Right? So we're seeing some positive impacts of some of these things. Right? You'll see probably in a generation, within this generation, less people looking to, people will go, well, that was me. What do you mean no one's going to drink cheap wine? That was how we grew up. So some of these things we're seeing as positive. We're also seeing, for example, a rise in loneliness. And I don't think these are permanent factors. I think this is about us learning things as a generation. Interestingly, what you're also seeing is a diminishing value in social media for young people, right? They're kind of getting a bit bored with it because it's now had its transactional value, and now I think what you'll see is a kind of a shift back to new ideas of community. We also shouldn't assume that all of these things are about digital. In fact, if you look at it at a macro level, we're also going through very, very significant economic restructuring. That means, once again, blue-collar men in, say, our coal cities are going to do it really tough, right, because of some of these economic forces. So some of these other changes aren't always about digital, but I think one of the things that I would say is that we should focus on the outcome, which is everyone wants to be happy and well, and you use the tools in your life to a point where they continue to drive increasing happiness and wellness, and if you reach that tipping point, change. So if your time on social media is actually making you less well and happy, stop it. If the relationships and the engagements you're having are doing really well, great. And that's always been my position to many parents. You don't actually, particularly teenagers try and control so much of their social media use. It's about saying, actually rise to a higher purpose. My job as a parent is to keep you safe first and foremost, and secondly, I want you to be happy and well. If you can manage your social media use and you can show me you're engaged with the family, you're doing sport and exercise, you've got friends and you're doing well at school, do I particularly care whether you spend an hour more on Facebook? No. As soon as I see some of those other factors start to decline, and you're spending more time in your bedroom than with your friends, you're dropping out of sport, and you're not spending time at the dinner table, do you know what? I'm going to have a bit of a crack at where you're spending your time. And so that kind of gives us some of those things, I think, tools as counsellors to say we always need to come back to the higher purpose, not some of those tactical things. Because we also know that for young people, not having access to their mobile phone also disconnects them from social relationships. Young people just don't plan anymore, right? When I was a teenager, we'll meet you at the cinema at 6:30 and we'll watch the 6:45 film, and everyone was there at 6:30 looking anxiously as to who was going to get in the back row, right? Now they just rock up, right? Text on the way, what are we going to do, and things change. If you're the one young person who rocks up at 6:30 down at Macquarie Centre, and everyone's decided to go back to someone else's house to Netflix, then you're just hanging out the front and no one's got any way to contact you. So some of these things are genuinely also about, if you remove some of these access points, then it actually can have a detrimental impact on mental health. So the big thing is, what is disruption, right? Disruption really for me is change, and we all experience change, but it's change that happens very, very quickly, and where the underlying rules don't apply anymore. And one of those rules are that you as counsellors, you as professionals, get to do stuff that not everyone else gets to do. So I did this presentation recently for lawyers and said, what happens if we get access to the law but we don't need you as lawyers anymore? And they went, what do you mean? Like, no, you need us. Like, you can't do stuff without us. It's like, yeah, but what happens if we just assume that lawyers aren't important anymore? We still want the legal outcome. We just don't want you. I mean, I don't understand. Lawyers have to be involved in the law. That's kind of part of the title, right? And I said that was true for taxi drivers up until Uber. Right? There was no way to get transport up until there was a way to get transport beyond taxis. So one of the things that's a real challenge for incumbents is that disruption happens where most of what we do is say we're protected by the rules of the industry, whether they be professional standards and a whole bunch of other things. And one of my challenges, for example, with government at the moment is government assumes that health systems have to go through it. What we're seeing in terms of some of the major challenges to health is actually governments are becoming far less relevant. It's like, I don't actually need you. I don't need you to tell me who I can access and where I can access. What happens if I want to get a counsellor in Indonesia? You can't do that because they don't apply our professional standards. Like, I just pay them directly. What are you going to do about it? I bet we'll give you a Medicare rebate. I don't want your Medicare rebate. I'm just going to do this anyway. So this centrality of this idea of the assumptions of the industry, right? And this would be my first point for you as an organisation. What are the things that you don't see? Because they're the things that will trip you up. And my challenge to lawyers, one of the things that they don't see is that in their mind, everyone needs a lawyer. Right? You go, but what happens if we remove that assumption? Well, the industry collapses. Yes, that's what disruption is. So the other thing is that you can either be on the right side of that or the wrong side of that. So what you see, for example, in banking at the moment is banks putting billions of dollars to protect the institution and protect the business model, which is they want to give out and get money, but willingly changing a lot of their business models to get there. So what they're realising is unless they adapt to some of these things like blockchain and elsewhere, then they as the brand will be superseded by some of the outside players. They're working pretty aggressively, for example, to make sure Apple doesn't become a financial institution, as an example, right? So it's not like folk don't see these things coming. Quite often they think they're protected by the rules. And what you see a lot in disruption is that those rules no longer apply, and then you have a willingness to go around them. Uber was essentially an illegal company for most of its life. Right? Just randomly broke laws around the world and did it till it got enough community support that the laws had to change. Right? So if you think some of these things like, oh, well, hold on, we've got these Medicare rebates and only certain people can do these things, it's like, yeah, what happens if that's not true? Right? It doesn't mean that they won't be true. It means that they don't necessarily become true. So how do you know that an industry is about to be disrupted? I think there's a few criteria. The first is there big money? Because disruption tends not to happen really quickly in areas where there can't be a kind of a draw of a capital base, right? Mental health is big money. It's big money and growing money, if you think about some of the changes that are happening globally. What does that mean? It means that the big guys are starting to look at it. Does it affect a large proportion of the population? Yes. Even by our own figures, probably 1 in 4 at any given time and 1 in 2 in our lifetime, right? And that's on the negative side. If you think on the upside of mental health, you're probably talking at any given time, upwards of 50% of the population would benefit from some sort of proactive mental health intervention, right? Whether it be a meditation, whether it be some other things, right? It's like, actually, this is big. So because it affects a lot of people, similar to like catching taxis and moving people around, it actually means that an industry can be created out of nothing. Is there a dissatisfied community? Yes. I actually think this is mental health's biggest problem. I have not gone anywhere in the world where anyone says we have a world-class mental health system. If you ask any consumer in mental health, they would say the system sucks, even if I like the individuals in the system. It's hard, I feel discriminated against. What does that mean? It means that if someone presents an alternative system, they will jump. Right? So one of your best protections to disruption is actually brand loyalty. People go, do you know what? I get a really good service from you guys. That actually reduces the need to jump. Right? This is mental health's biggest problem. That we have a very, very large dissatisfied community who, if offered a better alternative with better customer service, a better emotional experience, my guess is a huge proportion of them would jump in a heartbeat. Is it provider controlled? Yes. Right? We determine the services that are provided. Right? We force everybody through our door. And occasionally we look at adapting that door, but fundamentally we determine what is mental health and the services that are being provided. And we tend to use things like evidence-based as a way of, oh, sorry, that's not evidence-based, we can't do that. One of the things I'll encourage our organisation to continue to do is be evidence-informed. Right? It doesn't mean you do things that you know to be wrong. You've still got a fundamental tenet, but it does mean that you can say, look, if we are evidence-informed, can we make this leap of faith? Right? Is the likelihood that doing a counselling session over video conferencing fundamentally worse and harmful than doing it face-to-face when the alternative is that person gets nothing at all? Probably not. That's an evidence-informed. You don't need to wait for 10 years of literature to kind of work out that, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that you do a whole bunch of things that you go, look, I can't see a rationale as to the way in which we do that. So that's how things kind of work. If it's provider control, people get very frustrated, right? Think of the frustration people had with banks when they continually fall through the 4 windows, right? And what banks did is start providing alternatives for people to do the things they want, and the satisfaction with the services, if not the brand, started to improve. Is it highly inefficient? Yes. We got a model, it's a model that is just not scalable. Right? When you look at the demand curve and you look at the supply, they're just not good. right? In fact, we did a study with EY that took the government at its word that it said that it wanted to have 50% of the population access high quality mental health care. They didn't, interestingly, put a time on said target. So we said, what happens if we took you at your word and didn't change the business model of mental health? Right? What you would have needed was another 8,000 plus counsellors, GPs, and other mental health professionals. And given the time of training, that was roughly a 12 to 15 year process to get to scale. Right? So essentially we then went, so you're just willing to sacrifice another generation to no hope? That doesn't seem really good, right? So it's not an efficient way of reaching that scale really quickly. And it's government protected, right? The rules the government puts down are very difficult. What does this mean? It means that you as a business and we as a business has a strong incentive to not change because our contracts require us not to change, right? So what you're finding in many of these places is where there's a high level of government protection, then the incumbents gear their business model around that protection. They seek comfort in it and think that that will be predictable. And that actually means that there's room for an outsider who doesn't get any of that protection to come in and disrupt the model, right? Because it's not about disrupting you, it's about disrupting the whole system. Right? It's got nothing to do with you guys or us. It's got to do with what happens if the system's challenged. We saw this recently through, I don't know if you guys kind of track Google search as much as I do. That sounds really weird. There was, through the gay marriage debate, some of our AdWords started being bought up by organisations in the US offering $89 unlimited counselling to LGBTI people affected by the gay marriage debate. Right? Just pinged in. I don't know whether this was churches looking at kind of, you know, change behaviour, whether it was evidence-based or whatever, it was just kind of pinging in. Great example of disruption, right? Somewhere in the US, people are starting to pick up that there was more and more search terms for mental health. People were distressed. They saw this thing and went, great, this is an opportunity to offer $89 unlimited counselling. So this is an example of someone who doesn't need to go through our tendering process and all those sorts of things going, I'm just going to put up a business model and see what flies. As an example of a government protection can sometimes hurt us. So in my view, if you look at all those criteria, mental health is really, really vulnerable. And it's vulnerable now because you're having this kind of moment of growing demand, and as stigma kind of drops, people are more comfortable and therefore wanting more help. A system that can't scale, and a high level of community dissatisfaction with the system that is. It means if you offer a new alternative, they'll jump at it. Think about the conditions of Uber, right? If people had a universally awesome experience in taxis, I suspect Uber would have struggled. The fact that most people had an experience where they felt unsafe in the taxi driver didn't know where to go, it often smelt, and it was otherwise just not a pleasant experience and expensive. You go, actually someone offers you an alternative of a friendly guy, person coming picking up in their own car and being happy with an $8 fare, you go, do you know what, that's pretty good. So it wasn't the nature of Uber that attracted people so much. It was actually the high level of dissatisfaction with the mandated system that they were forced to go through. And so that's our challenge now in mental health. So my view is the disruption's already underway. One of the challenges that we've got as incumbents is because of some of these legacy effects. Because of some of these legacy effects of contracts, we think it can be further away when in fact it's already happening. This is one of the great things. I think banks have kind of got onto this. They really quickly worked through what does blockchain mean for our business models, and have in fact been investing in some of these areas for a number of years to kind of keep their hand in, so that when it hits a scale point, they're ready to move. What you see with things like the music industry and the book industry is they just hoped it would go away. Some of the early signs of pirating were there, right? And they just went, I'm going to double down on our old business model, and they didn't adjust in time. And then when the moment happened, they were too slow. They were still 3 years away from making the change. So one of the challenges, and I know you guys have invested in social enterprise and the technology space, to some extent I think you're well ahead of the curve on some of these things. But it does, generally for incumbents, it's generally about a 3-year change, 4-year change, even with really well financed, because it's actually about changing our culture, changing our workplace, going to boards, looking at different business models. These things take years. Whereas an incumbent has a disruptor has no history, right? So it's all upside for them, no downside. They don't have to change anything, they just see the upside, whereas you have to change. So my view is, if you think disruption at scale is happening in 3 years' time, get cracking now. If you look at what's happening around the world, there's some kind of fascinating trends in this space. So I'm sure some of you are aware of the Headspace meditation app. I don't think it's a particularly special app, right? It's like, it's like most meditation apps, is somewhere along there's going to be a waterfall sound and a jingling bell and a person with a calm voice, male and female, and they walk you through, thinking about your toes for 10 minutes, right? It's not revolutionary. It's also worth $250 million and just raised $40 million in Series B, I think, capital fundraising, 40 million, right? From their point of view, if they get to scale and they build a brand that's about well-being, I guarantee they won't look to stop at meditation. They'll become a well-being brand. In the same way Uber started with black cars and then became a transport company, right? So where they start isn't where they end. They use the money, and what they've really built is a customer loyalty scheme. That's why they're worth $250 million, because they've got a customer loyalty scheme, because people pay as opposed to giving away. So that's a big disruption, because of what it means is venture capital is moving into this space. What you see here is MindStrong. So this was a venture by a guy called Tom Insel, who's the former director of National Institute of Mental Health in the US. Then went across to Google Life Sciences to head up their mental health division, has recently split off from Google Life Sciences, and I'll be amazed if Google aren't a lead investor in his business called MindStrong, which is about basically remote automated diagnosis for mental health issues, right? Heavily backed, institutionally led, kind of big guys. If you think about how much of our business model will be diagnosis and those sorts of things, that's actually a pretty big slice of mental health, particularly in the US, where you've got a whole bunch of stuff to do with how mental health is funded. And then the third thing, which I think is really fascinating, is Google have just launched inside the Google search results a depression test. So essentially you're moving to self-diagnosis kind of levels, right? Now what Google's kind of play is, I don't know, but what it will do is give them access to data. And once they have access to data, that data can learn. And once it can learn, it can do things better. So people have been kind of got off on the wrong foot on some of these things to say, oh, but that would never be as good as what I could do. And from Google's point of view, where you start is never where you end, right? So whereas you are kind of capped in your knowledge, Google will have series of machines that will go endlessly 24 hours a day, learning and learning and learning and learning and learning until they get it better than a person, guaranteed. So these are some of the changes, or the reason why I think there are areas of disruption, and probably my second piece of advice to you guys as a group is, what are the areas of your business? If you think about your business model as a series of interactions, right? It could be coming through the door, therefore someone's got to drive. It could be booking in particular sessions. So just break it right down to its granular level and go, which of these elements could be changed and disrupted? Who could do this better than us? And if so, that might give you a business opportunity. I know you've done it with Radiant, right? Could we actually make it far easier to find who could the counsellors be? Could we monetize some of those things? But there are other areas, and kind of says, look, actually we could get out of some of those spaces and actually really focus on the areas where we add really, really deep value, and focus on some of those things. So I've spoken a little bit about this. The cracks are opening in mental health, but what will be some of the challenges that I think you need to look out for? The first is, and I referenced this in the recent Google search debate, is we'll move from national delivery and local delivery to global delivery. That you won't be competing with Mission Australia or anyone else for your kind of, is it your 2019 contract, Elizabeth? You won't be competing with those as providers, you'll be competing with global providers, right? Because the rules of incumbency won't apply anymore. And in fact, those providers could not be even interested in your government contract because they may be able to access 40, 50, $100 million in capital from the US or elsewhere, right? So you may not even see them coming for your business, they'll just kind of move your clients elsewhere. So one of the challenges, and I'm certainly saying this to a lot of organisations, is one of the rules that we think of is that our business is on local, and we look inward, and we think about our competitors inwardly rather than outwardly, and say who is it that could be there. Profit is the major motive. Be no doubt that most of these companies are libertarian in nature, right? I think to your point around some of the challenges around social capital in this space, one of the challenges that we have in this space is most of the businesses and most of the value is being captured fundamentally by white men trained at Stanford who live in Silicon Valley. My brother lived there, and it's really, really weird. Really weird place, right? But they think they're smarter than everybody else, right? But fundamentally, it's also a people who think about society differently than quite often the rest of the world, right? So one of the challenges that we'll see here is that they're willing to kind of quite often trash a lot of the things that our communities value around social capital to kind of drive really quick profits. I actually think this is a great opportunity for civil society to come together and say, we have a great brand and the brand is civil society. Right? Australians value things like Medicare. Australians value things like you guys. The question is, can we work out a way to compete and leverage that brand to make sure they do a deal with us? And they are very sensitive to this. I know Google is probably the most sensitive to this, where they are probably more likely to do a deal with civil society than they are to go around it. If they can't do a deal, they're willing to quash you as a general rule, right? And they're not particularly emotional about it, I've got to say. Chances are you guys and us as Reach Out will won't be the major motive, we'll just be caught up in the whitewash. They won't necessarily notice us because they're looking at these big global changes. And the third thing, which I think is really fascinating, I love doing this at government things because I go, and you guys are unimportant. And you feel all the bureaucrats go, but no, we write the rules. It's like, yeah, but not so much. Right? And the best example is Uber. Government was important in the transport industry up until it's not. And then it's scrambling. Right? So this is then the kind of greatest opportunity is what would happen if you then built a business that wasn't reliant on government contracts? And what would that free you up to do? Right? If you said, do you know what, I just don't need to worry about you. I dictate the terms to you. Not because I don't need or like you for legislation and rules and stuff, but fundamentally the power's shifted to the individual. I'm not paid by you, I'm paid by the individual. So government has to respond. Right? So these are some of the things that mean that we'll have to start thinking differently. If you think about the changes that are happening now through NDIS, if some of these changes happening, and that's a slow, cumbersome process with a lot of waste built in. If you think about this elsewhere, this is what tends to happen. That you find globalised delivery rather than local delivery. Profit is the major motive. So the guys, and they have good social intent, don't get me wrong. You know, I don't think the guys who started the Headspace had anything other than the same benevolent intent as your founders. They're just willing to make a big load of cash along the way. Right? So profit is not an evil here. It just means that you can draw down on capital that we and often in the non-profit sector can't draw down on. And governments have little power. So I'll go through a couple of things that I think broadly you should think about and then stop and see if you go, look, actually that's just too much this morning. I need a mental break from all this. Or we can have a conversation, or we can go on to some of the thinking styles of some of these organisations. So the first thing I would say that you as a business needs to do is continuously think global. Actually have a group of people, and as part of your leadership group, build into sessions at least once a month doing global scans. What's happening out there? Let's do it like, if we did this, what would that, who are the big rivals? Track where the capital's moving, right? Part of it you start seeing is that there are things moving and quite often happen in different territories first. So one of the things when I came back recently from the UK, I said to our guys, like, voice has gone off in the UK. Right? Voice was everywhere. There was Google Home rivaling the Amazon product. Everywhere when I stayed with friends, as one of my friends was cleaning the house, he just teased the voice-activated Google Home, like mercilessly, just asking it random questions in Spanish and trying to get it to answer until it broke. Right? But to your point around company, right? It could be actually, if the voice becomes real and I'm a lonely person, just talking to Google Home and asking it stuff and sending me photos become a really kind of important way in which loneliness is overcome. But what the important point about that is once you think global, you can start spotting trends elsewhere and go, how would voice change our business? What would that mean for us in terms of the way in which we act? So would that mean that people who don't come from an English-speaking background, who might be nervous about speaking to a person who might be nervous about navigating a computer, can just as easily talk into Google Home saying, call Relationships Australia, I want to speak to my counsellor right now. Get through some barriers. So it could be about business opportunities or it could be about business threats. I know you're doing all of this already with your social enterprise, but for me it's really, and I'm challenging our own board around this stuff, is how can we as civil society draw on different capital streams? Because one of the challenges of government and philanthropic investment is it's highly secure and very steady, but it's also very boring and very risk averse. So one of the challenges in these spaces of disruption is what you see is high risk capital moving and congregating around big ideas. And so what it does is change the notion of speed. So things that used to, if you're thinking about government, they tend to think, oh, well, we can do that over a 20-year period by doling out the cash evenly. What these guys do is like, what would happen if you drew all that capital down in the next 3 years and made a big investment bet, right? So part of the thing for me about thinking about different investment streams and how you can access it is actually giving yourself the most opportunity to compete on some of these things because you have an advantage in sort of that recurrent capital space. We're actually really disadvantaged on some of these new capital streams that these businesses can access in a global sense. And the third thing that I would say is don't have a digital strategy, have an innovation strategy. Right, most of the challenges of this space are actually not about what you do or even the knowledge that you should do it. It's actually about the resistance of the organisation to change. And so one of the things that I would say we continuously do at Reach Out is examine and have models for how we can change and bake that in so that from our crew, that change is not seen as a threat, change is seen as an opportunity. And therefore they're wanting and moving in the direction of change. And we go back to the fundamentals. We're changing our name, changing, what is it about our mission? Can we change our business model? We change the nature of our service delivery. Everything is up for grabs. And so the question isn't why you stay the same, the question is why you don't change. Putting structures in place, we have a model that might be of interest called the 3 Horizons model. It was done by a McKinsey guy here in Australia, which is essentially Horizon 1 is your economic engine now, so that might be your government contract and things like that. Horizon 2 are bets that you think are reasonable that might generate a new income stream for you guys or a new business model, and that might be some of your new ventures, but it could very well be different kind of models of care. And Horizon 3 are big bets. But you don't put a lot of money, but you go, actually, let's put a little bit of money to something like voice or something like a different business models. And what it kind of forces the organisation to do is just think in each of these streams as a matter of behaviour. And try and then work out how do you take ideas up and move them down as some of these opportunities move. So that would probably be my final kind of big play view is I think the organisations that do very well in this space are not necessarily digital organisations. They're organisations that very quickly adapt and see adaptation as a positive rather than a threat. And this is really kind of the thing. If you think about Amazon, Amazon's actually a logistics company, not a shop. Right? Generates a huge amount of its money through logistics, doing logistics more efficiently than anybody else. It's actually a loyalty scheme. About 80-90% of Americans are now and that monetizes that loyalty. It realised there was a big opportunity in small business and cloud services. So it wasn't, if it had stuck to its shopping model, probably wouldn't have done as well. But it's actually an amazingly good innovation organisation that can adapt their business model really quickly. The benefit and the great thing about Steve Jobs was he realised that they were no longer a computer company. They're also a music company, so a film company, right? And so once you're freed up from thinking that what you do is make computers, then you have an ability to change and an ability to move with the times. So that would be my fundamental thing. I think if you say we're a counselling organisation, for want of a better term, how other people view you, then you make yourself very vulnerable to disruption. If you say we're a mental health organisation, what does that mean and what are the opportunities in there? All of a sudden, there might be some other opportunities that you can accept or reject. Doesn't mean you have to do them all. It just really kind of lays it out. So that's kind of really it on the, how do you think differently? What are some of the big trends that would happen here? Probably want to stop there. I'm conscious I've been talking at you for a little while and see if there are any questions or thoughts that you might have in relation to some of those things.
One of my thoughts is this next bit.
Yeah.
There's a lot of jargon out there at the moment.
Yeah.
Artificial intelligence, machine learning, etc., etc. You maybe just educate us, if you like, on
Sure.
what the jargon is and real examples of what artificial intelligence is.
Sure. So the first part is, and this is why an innovation R&D engine is much more important than a technology strategy, because technology strategy tends to mean you jump to, oh, we're going to chase voice and then we're going to chase artificial intelligence, but you don't know why. An R&D engine really is about why we make business decisions, where do we invest our dollars, and how do we scale that up. So that's probably the most important thing I can say there. That said, there's some fascinating things and big trends that are happening at the moment, and the most important is machine learning. This is essentially where these companies get machines, they get huge amounts of data, and then create algorithms that themselves get smarter over time. So the more data you feed it, the more it understands the processes that sit behind it. So what this means is that machines do better now on almost all repetitive tasks. So it's the big threat, for example, to accounting. At the moment, the big accountancy firms that might have 100 people doing an audit, what the machine learning will enable them to do is, like, rather than have 100 people scan BHP's business transactions that go, we'll put it through these machines continuously, and it can spot one cell difference because it's running 24 hours a day and getting, and not only that, it gets smarter about how to do these things. So that's really the machine learning. The other kind of part of it is this kind of question around automation, which is how do these machines learning then get applied in different ways and turn into different kind of business models. So one of it would be it then can apply back into interactions. So you think about bots, and this is probably again the big threat to counselling, is when they've actually done tests between a person and a bot in counselling, the bot tends to win on compassion. Right? Because it doesn't make mistakes, it doesn't get frustrated, it's not thinking about the next session, right? It's just doing the thing that we say we do, like how do you build, and you think about it, if you're not physically there, how do you build empathy? We actually go through a whole series of repetitive processes. We ask questions, we ask open-ended questions, we do all the things that we're trained to do, right? It just does those as well and does it in an interaction style. And the person's brain kind of tricks itself for seeing something that is there. Think about it as like the computerized version of scammers, right? The benefit of scammers is actually not about, is there some strange Nigerian scheme? It's about their ability over online to use psychology to build a relationship with you, to get you to do something, right? It's not that different than what we do. We just have good intent at the end. Right? To build a relationship, to get someone to take a risk. Their risk is give me the money, our risk is change your life. So that's what you're starting to see now in terms of the applications of these machine learning now into various areas of repetitive, and voice being the classic example. Voice is actually really hard because there's so much diversity, and so these machines then they're creating products. What you see then in things like YouTube is every time you use the voice, that voice goes back into the machine and it gets smarter. To the extent where my 4-year-old navigates YouTube Kids by voice. He sings the opening lines to his favourite show called Charlie's Kitchen. For many of you got small children, it's a very annoying show. The YouTube Kids recognise it. He doesn't need to type anymore. He can navigate the internet perfectly well. So these are some of the applications. If you think what the science behind a 4-year-old who doesn't pronounce words very well and all that sort of stuff, and accents is then kind of particularly good. Was there another one that you were asking about in some of those education?
General, yeah.
What about the Internet of Things? What's that?
Yeah, so that's where your physical devices start interacting with the internet, essentially. And so if you think about it, the Internet of Things is really, that might be your watch, your Fitbit interacting with the internet to send it information back without you doing anything. So then starts applying to your fridge and everything else. What that means is there's a huge amount of opportunities, for example, in monitoring and triggering interaction. So we're now starting to see this fascinatingly in aged care, for example, where the Internet of Things will realise that someone hasn't moved out of their bed, and and then that's a trigger then for a nurse going in and looking at someone in aged care, rather than someone just really intruding into your room in an aged care facility when you're getting dressed, just because that's when the nurse does his rounds. It's like, actually, if you're out of bed and you're moving around, the Internet of Things can trigger a system that says that person's fine, they're moving around, don't worry about them, for example. So that's the sort of applications you start seeing if devices and things move and monitor around.
But you could, in theory, you could hook yourself up to some sort of wellbeing app that could trigger something to happen through the Internet of Things, some sort of response.
Yeah. In fact, that's one of the things that as you start seeing these things come together, right? The Internet of Things generate data, that data goes into machine learning, the machines get smarter, gets more data points and keeps sort of getting better, is it then starts getting predictive. So it's one of the things we're looking at Reach Out is if we can get enough data into our machine learning, we're doing a machine learning trial, then we can start getting more and more granular. And I think the biggest opportunity here for counselling is that what's the likelihood of failure? So every intervention has failure. I've never met a counsellor who said that didn't work, because we have an incentive to not fail, right? So what the Internet of Things can start doing is saying, actually, counsellors like you interacting with a person like this, having symptoms like this, if they're not seeing a recovery within 3 weeks, the chances of recovery are under 30% and change track. And then you get an alert saying, actually, on this person's biometric data, they're not improving on this, this, and this. You should start trialling a new intervention. So rather than actually replacing you, it actually can make you smarter, because it takes out some of the guesswork, for example, in counselling would be an application that you start seeing.
So what's the machine learning trial that you're looking at, if I can ask?
Yeah, so this is really about how do we move our data into a machine learning state, because it's actually quite a lot of complex data, so it's stage 1 of that. And then for us, there will probably be a couple of trials, one which will be about predictive data.
Yeah.
So could we, for example, combine our user data with social media data that looks at relationship status, and so that when a relationship status changes, we can send a message into Facebook that says, are you going through a tough time?
Yeah.
Come to Reach Out. And we target an ad about relationship breakups.
Yeah.
Would be a way in which we're looking at combining our data and Facebook data to become better at targeting, knowing that obviously mental health needs go up at points of high distress and high change.
Yeah.
So that would, part of it is also we're looking at a program called Moderator Assist, which would be training, so we have peer support. Community members, so if they're moderating and we want them to do it along evidence-based lines, that the machine can learn about their responses and start suggesting to them the most evidence-based response that they can insert. So they can do what they do best, which is being empathic and connect. What we can then do is say, at this point you should probably say this. And then they wrap it up as a way of assisting a peer support person without a huge amount of training to deliver an evidence-based intervention. And then as those things get better, it will be kind of better and better and better. So there are lots of different ways in which I think all businesses can apply some of these things. The hardest thing is getting your business in a model to do it. Any other questions?
I assume you're going to talk more around an innovation engine.
Yes.
Yeah, which is.
I'll go through that quickly now in about another half hour. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So this is really, for me, there's 3 books I actually recommend. There's lots of books I recommend you read. The 3 books around this space that are great are actually 3 biographies. The first is the biography of Jeff Bezos called The Everything Store. The second is there's a biography, an authorised biography of Steve Jobs, which I think might just be called Steve Jobs. It was the one they turned into the movie. And then the third is the authorised biography of Elon Musk. The reason why I like them as authorised biographies, Elon Musk. So you've got Apple, you've got essentially the energy kind of play with Elon Musk with his businesses, and then you've got shopping. The thing I like about it is because it's authorised, this is what they allow to say about themselves. And actually, one thing I got to say is they're all awful human beings. You know, like Steve Jobs not wanting a parking spot, but consistently parking in disabled parking. It's like, really? You're one of the world's richest men, you couldn't get someone to drop you off? But so there's some interesting things about their behaviour. One of the things that's fascinating about those authorised biographies is you actually realise they are willing to cross quite a lot of social boundaries to win. Right? Why do they win? They're actually quite often prepared to do things that we don't do. Right? And it's just not saying we should replicate it. It's just a kind of a fascinating insight into the way in which these guys operate. And so out of some of those in different books, I pulled out some of these things. The first part, which I find really fascinating about these companies, is they all have a big vision and a ridiculous time frame. And so if you think about project management principles, then you generally can control three things, which is time, scope, and cost, right? So what they do is they set this ambitious scope, a short time, and so what's the only answer? A load of money, right? So why do they raise billions and billions and billions of dollars? Is they don't say, oh, I want to create a store that can sell books over a 20-year period. They go, I want to build the everything store and I want it in 5 years. Like, wow, that's big. You must need billions of dollars to do that, right? So it's a fascinating thing, and for me, the reason why I present this often in social organisations is we often have a big vision and no time frame and no capital, right? And so, one of the things would be, zero suicide in 5 years, let's get it done. We go, it can't be done, why not? Well, we'd have to do all these changes. Okay, yeah, that'll cost a lot of money. Yeah, but we'd have to train up all these people. Yeah, that'll cost a lot of money. Right? So you just keep going, it costs a lot of money. It costs a lot of money. Yeah, we'd have to reprioritise all these things. Yeah, that'll cost a lot of money. Right? So that's what these guys do, is they set these outrageous visions. And then they set these ridiculous kind of time frames to get it done. And even when they miss it, they've moved the needle. Right? Elon Musk is probably the best at this. I want to be on Mars within, I think it's a 20-year time frame. To do that, and he literally backward engineered, right? If I want to be on Mars, I have to have my own rocket company. If I have my own rocket company, it has to do these things. And then I have to control the whole of the energy system. And he just kind of went, wow. Right? At no point did he say, maybe getting onto Mars in 20 years is a stupid idea. Right? So, and he didn't, and so what you then start seeing is they're willing to do things and change the rules because they're frustrated by these timelines. Right? So it would be, what happens if you guys said, oh, we want to be a global company, global organisation delivering, 1 million sessions a day, and we want to do it in 5 years. What would that look like? What would we have to do to get that done? And that would mean maybe we can't do it with our business model, maybe we need to raise $100 million. It kind of challenges you to think differently about what you do. So that would be the one thing I would say. The trap of social organisations is we think small. And when we think small, we attract small capital. And these guys don't worry about it. The second thing we've spoken a little bit about this is they use data and people to challenge conventional wisdom, right? Far from being anti-people, which is the way they're quite often portrayed, these guys invest more in understanding people than we do. Right? Jeff Bezos was famous for having an empty seat at every leadership team meeting for the customer. So what would the customer want? What would the customer want? What would the customer want? How can we serve the customer better? And so what it did is drive a whole bunch of their innovation engine of like, well, if I buy a book, why do I want to wait for 3 weeks? Why can't I get it in 3 hours? What would we have to do? Because that's what the customer would want, right? So a really kind of fascinating insight where they continuously put themselves in the mind of the customer and willingly take changes to get it done. A similar one with Steve Jobs, where he realised that the biggest threat to the iPod was the phone. What happens if someone puts all their music in a phone? And he went, maybe we should do it. Came up with the iPhone, right? Put his mind, he just was looking around, he's like, everyone's carrying around a mobile phone. Why would they want to carry a mobile phone and an iPod? What's the one thing that would go? The iPod, right? So, but it was a deep insight into the needs of people. What you often find with these guys is they invest a huge amount of money in things like user experience design and co-design, and they'll do it through all kind of steps of the business to try and understand what that would be. I recently did this presentation for a psychiatric institution in the UK, and said, look, I've just done this myself. I've imagined that I've got an emerging psychotic illness, and I've just got off the train because I can't afford a car to get here, and I'm trying to get to your hospital. I'm really distressed, and there's no sign. What do I do? I went, what do you mean? What? Why couldn't I get a sign from the train station to say, go this way, there's help available? We've never thought of it. But do you reckon it would have been a lot of value if you actually understood the journey of someone with an emerging psychotic illness to help them safely get from the train station where they're likely to be to the institution where you've got caring people, rather than just waiting for them to rock up and die on the train lines? So what these guys do is they put themselves in the mind and say, what are the simple changes we can make to make the customer's life better within our mission? They are insane about it. They are disciplined about it. They will slightly change a font. They will change a colour. They will go down to the biggest minutiae because they're always looking at it, and they're using data, so the aggregated experiences of people, and then individual experiences, working with people, and then they co-design it up and they put it through testing. So I think one thing I find fascinating about social organisations is we say that we're people-centred, and we're actually not. We're quite often service-centred. Right? And what these guys are doing is willingly, continuously, to change their business model down to the minutiae and do what's there. One of the most fascinating experiences for me when I did this for the official visitors program. And I was going through this, and it was like, oh, we're really hard, and we don't, the psychiatrists are mean, and I was like, so let's work this through. Within literally 20 minutes, they came up with an idea that said, what would happen if we got all the security guards to wear Hawaiian shirts? $20 at the local op shop store. They went, actually, I think that would make people feel a little bit safer. If the first person to greet them wasn't a person who's likely to take them away, but a person who said, hi, can I help you in a Hawaiian shirt? What's the downside? Security guard feels like a bit of an idiot. Right? Someone said, oh, there's a similar program already enrolled at our hospital. We could do that. So one of the things that these guys do is it's not always about big changes. It's actually about the little changes that they do continuously and willing to test and use data to do it. And then this is the model. This is the innovation. Test, learn, adapt, scale. What's the idea? Can we do it now? What do we learn from it? So it's not about the implementation of the idea and scale. It's actually about what do we learn from it. Maybe the insight from the Hawaiian shirts is that people find it a bit freaky and they think they're in the wrong place. So what would we do differently about it? So how do you then put a learning engine at the back of it? My suggestion was actually just to ask people as they enter, going, hey, this is what we've done. Did that make you feel safer? You're not changing the whole system. You're asking one simple question. The intent of putting a Hawaiian shirt on security guards is to make people feel safer. Right? We did it. How we learn from it, we ask people. If they say yes, then we do it more, and then we scale it and scale it and scale it. Once we hit a really solid insight after the adaptation phase, then we scale. What happens most often in social organisations is we go test. That's generally, like, let's get trial funding for this thing. Then we start learning, but we're really nervous that we've wasted our money, and so we go straight to scale, right? So, or we kill it off because it hasn't worked yet, it hasn't been perfect yet. These guys take a very, very different approach, and they do it on an enormous scale, and they do it really quickly. Size isn't a barrier. Actually, one of the most interesting things is you guys as a very well-funded organisation are probably the most vulnerable because you've got the most to defend. So this was my pitch to the official visitors program, being single operators, is you have the most freedom to do things. You have the least kind of work that you need to do. So size isn't a barrier. Actually being small sometimes can give you a great opportunity, and sometimes size can be your biggest problem. Think about Microsoft missing the mobile era because it was big. It wasn't, Bill Gates famously wrote a letter saying mobiles are coming. Cloud is coming. He knew every big trend that was emerging and wrote a letter, open letter to his staff to say, these are the things that are coming. They did none of it. Right? Lost the next kind of series of battle. So size and money isn't always to your benefit. It's really about the culture that matters. And then this is the final thing. This is the bit where I'll do the thing around technology and how this might then lead into a digital strategy. which is my view is anything that allows self-management is good. People generally like to control things themselves, right? Have the opportunity to not do it, but they generally prefer control. Any part of your business that can be automated should be put on the table. Technology generally does repetitive, automated functions better than humans. And this was the big insight that has come through banks, which is, if you think back, in the 1990s, they started the program to close down branches because they knew that the business model for them was hopeless, right? They could never open enough branches to keep the community satisfied, right? So they just took a big hit. They all started closing branches. At the same time, they invested massively in self-management tools. Firstly, ATMs, then kind of other tools, and they've screwed up some things along the way with things like call centres and stuff like that. But generally, they've got more right than wrong. And certainly, if you talk to an 18-year-old now about going and talking to a bank, you go, why would I bother with that? Like 90% of the banking needs are now in self-management kind of territory for us on a day-to-day level. And so it was a very disciplined process about stripping out the parts of the business that can be better done and will drive satisfaction to the users through self-management. So that'd be my final thing, is you look through the length of your business, all the things you do, and go, what is it that we could turn into a self-management tool? That's probably your low-hanging fruit on innovation and change. And the great thing is that what it frees you up is to do the bit that you're really special at, and quite often your staff love, which is spend time with people. And this was my pitch to the lawyers, because they were all lawyers that were interested in health justice, was you're with a person, you're trying to provide legal solutions for a person experiencing domestic violence. Rather than quoting at them statutes and all these things that they can do, what about just spending 45 minutes with them and talking to them? Knowing that that other 45 minutes in your head that was being done over here is actually automated, and you can spend more time on add value. So the other kind of part of this that comes with the self-management is the risk of these businesses is you do more. And in fact, the trend of some of these technology companies is they do less. They do less of the stuff, and they do more stuff that's of high value. You're starting to see some of these changes coming through legal firms and accounting firms and others. Actually, the reason why you come back to us is because you feel as if we care, and we can show you we care by spending time with you. The way in which we can free up that time is we can automate the things, the intake forms and all the stuff that you have to do, so that when you're there, your whole experience with us is one of connectedness. So that is probably the biggest lesson that I would say around is how much of your organisational time is being spent by doing things that actually are annoying for you. You don't do very well, right? It's low value stuff, and actually leads to a worse experience for the people you serve. What are the parts of your business that you should amplify with that time? So that might be taking on more clients, or it might be expanding the business with the same kind of resource base, or it might be more deeply engaged with the clients you have, so that they're getting a better experience and you're getting a better experience. What's the risk that I've seen in a lot of organisations around this? Is they just end up doing more useless stuff. So they free up the time in automation, only do more useless stuff over here, create more paperwork, do all those sorts of things. So it's one of the things that we're, I'd say, really focused on at Reacher is actually how do we keep doing less? What are the big things that we can do that will drive benefit, and try and get people to stop doing the stuff that drives marginal benefit for the people we serve. It's really hard. So it's probably the biggest leadership challenge, because those small things like sending emails also give you a sense of being busy, and it's the busyness that quite often drives it. But again, the one thing I would say about these technologies, they are ferocious, absolutely ferocious on spending their time doing the things that drive the business and getting rid of the stuff that they don't. And that's part of the reason why they can scale at an insane level. So they're it. None of them, as I said, are really kind of technology based. I think, as Elizabeth said, you're at an amazing moment in an organisation. You've already invested in some of these things. I think you're well ahead, obviously, with an engaged board and thinking about different business models and a whole bunch of other things. I think probably the one risk that would be here is if innovation is seen as an enterprise part of the organisation, not as us. And go back to my central point that I opened up with, which is every day you ask the people you serve to take risks, to make changes, and to do it for a higher purpose, which is to be happy as well. Businesses and organisations are incredibly successful when they do the same. When you can find that higher purpose and then look at every part of your organisation saying, could we do things differently to lead towards that higher purpose? I've got to say, as a CEO of an organisation, when you pitch it that way, people are excited to change. When it's pitched as we want you to do more or do things differently with no sense of higher purpose, people quite rightly go, hold on, you're just annoying me now. So that would be the one thing I think, would say you have to kind of keep baking in, which is, what's the higher purpose? How do we get everybody attached to that higher purpose? What are we willing to sacrifice for that higher purpose? And probably a tangible example for us, if you see the Reach Out Strategic Plan. The Reach Out Strategic Plan has helping another million Australians in the year 2020. So we genuinely went, wow, my argument around KPIs is, if it doesn't make a leader want to vomit, it doesn't count. Every one of our KPIs went through the vomit test. Because if it's not ambitious enough, you kind of in your head go, oh, you clock that in at 70%, right? You give yourself some cover as a leader. If it's too ambitious, you go, I could not achieve that and no one's going to hold me accountable. The best KPI is the one where you go, actually a lot has to go right and I'd be on the hook for it, and that makes me want to vomit. So helping a million more was deliberately set up as that was our kind of global, that would draw resources we wanted to grow. We put in KPIs that would drive that, and then we deliberately put in some of this change language in. So you'll see stream 2 for us is beyond.com. We are known as reachout.com. So it was a very strong nod to our organisation to say we are willing to give up the core of our identity to help more people. What are we going to do about it? And we spent a year with our crew working it through, and came out of it, and the explosion of that has been enormous. Because people know that the ultimate goal, the higher purpose, is to help another million Australians. And everyone is there because they want to help more young people. And being transparent that to do that we have to look at our business model and protect the things that work and change the things that don't. And that the leadership puts up the core identity of their organisation to be willing to do that was a big part. And literally I would say in 2 or 3 months the ideas that started coming through and then looking at other opportunities were really enormous. So I know you're going through a strategic review and a whole bunch of other things at the moment. I don't think it means always big changes, but it does mean kind of getting this story of what's the higher purpose, how do you put that in a short timeline, and then how do you put on the table the things that you want on the table to get people excited about that higher purpose, and it generally works pretty well. So thank you.
I think that was a feast of ideas, wasn't it? And we have 2 more board members here, which is fantastic, and we have recorded the session so that everyone can be included. I don't know how much you're influenced by Socratic thinking, but this notion of the higher purpose has a long and noble tradition, and that would be a very interesting conversation for us to have. It's quite a slippery concept in many ways, but we could do some interesting thinking together about that. So we had a session on Monday for another purpose, and we were talking about if we were to think about the way we run our business in terms of today, tomorrow and the future, where do we spend our time? We did a bit of a straw vote for that exercise. And I think those who were here agreed that a lot of the time we spend in the today category, where we keep working on perennial problems and we trip over the same things. And in fact, that whole session was about how much we trip over each other, which is even stranger. And then we talked about how we dabble into tomorrow and that we haven't yet got a future strategy, really. If hand on heart, we really had to admit it. And so everything you've said today is incredibly on point for the people that were part of that conversation. So I think you've set us up well to be brave and to be having some different conversations. And I guess the other thing that really matters to me, for those of you I've talked about this a lot, is that we're not sufficiently client-centric, although we think we are. That there wouldn't be anybody here who doesn't intend to be. But so often when we're talking about management, we are actually just talking about how our own days run and how we can feel more productive amongst the way we just function in the office, and clients aren't part of our conversation really if we analyse things that way. And so to have goals that are truly about our clients at the other end of what we do, I think if we were to be disciplined about that, we'd be doing things quite differently. They're the things that certainly were top of mind reactions. You'll all have your own. I know Jono's on a time limit.
I can go a little bit more time. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, so I guess they're the things that stand out for me. So having said that, and because I was worried you had to leave, I'd be interested just in things that stand out for you from what's been said.
Jono, thank you so much. That's been fantastic. One of the things that I'm struggling with a bit at the moment is when we talk about a higher purpose. That's fantastic. We talk about breaking rules, and I get that too. In fact, it was only yesterday we had a conversation at the leadership team where we were really struggling with, we know what the higher purpose is. Potentially it might require breaking some rules, but where's the ethic? Where do we sit ethically around all of that? And I guess I'm just interested from a reachout.com perspective, with all the shifts and the change, and how you're being so audacious and aspirational, how you've handled, managed those kinds of things.
That's a great question. So I think the first part of it is, I would say as a CEO, the building blocks of our organisation are our mission, our values, and our strategic plan. Our mission is our higher purpose. Is this genuinely about helping more young people be happy and well, or not? Our values, and one of the big things that we did with our values is put behaviours against them. That for us was about how we go about that purpose. And it's, I'd say the value of compassion. Everyone views themselves as compassion, but the behaviours then are the way in which we choose to behave and exercise compassion collectively in our business. So that gets everyone on the why are we doing what we're doing, and how do we behave with each other kind of piece, right? And then the strategic plan is, well, what's the direction that we're going in the next 3 years? Underneath it, and I think what gives us, some interesting courage around this, is that we spend most of our time and most of our decisions are driven by what young people tell us using this methodology. So a great example of that is we changed, so we upgrade our platform roughly every 3 years. So we deliberately go through a very confronting process of throwing out everything and starting again. Like literally, we start with the theory of change. Why do we exist? Build it up, then build up the logic model, build it up and build it up until you see an execution model. So deliberately just give ourselves the freedom to chuck out everything and keep the things that were valuable. And we do obviously do that then informed by the needs of young people. One of the most important changes that we made is that we don't ask our volunteers for advice. Why? Because they've got the most incentive to keep things the same way. Your most satisfied clients are the ones who don't want change. Right? What most organisations do is they ask their existing clients. So we changed around and said, look, let's go out and research and spend time with young people who would benefit from Reach Out who don't like us. And spend all our research time saying, well, why not? What's the thing? Well, what do we need to change? And what they come back is always, your model doesn't work for me. And so we do this now, it's now baked into our co-design research process of continuously engaging those that we should serve and that we're clearly not serving very well. And then we also do the work with our volunteers, but it's always balanced out. It's really confronting for our volunteers. But once they realise, they go, oh yeah, that's great. And so what that means is that, we've just done it recently, we've got some really kind of big insights that there's an interesting shift amongst young people around the language of mental health, that as soon as they see mental health, they see it as good for others. And that this generation, to the first point, it seems to be a generation that is very, very comfortable in high stress. They don't see it as abnormal. And so they see that help is for other people because I'm not going through a tough time, yet when you do the underlying analysis, they're really unwell. So for us, it was like, well, what do we need to do, right? We should be helping these people, and the only solution we can come at it is we need to have a whole bunch of work to reinvent the core of our business model and the core of our identity. So we're just going through the other side of that of what does that mean. But that, I'd say that'd be the thing that is most important, is what gives you the courage is just that simple repetitive process of keep asking the people who you don't help, and do it very genuinely and do it in a very structured way and introduce that into your change processes as a really important part. I think the other part is social organisations tend to be obsessed by big change. We kind of go the other way. I think we're more obsessed with little change. If we say through the same-sex marriage debate of like talking to young people, the biggest insight that we had from young people was they didn't know how to put something in a postbox. They didn't know where a postbox was. So we ran a whole bunch of social media that looked really stupid to adults, which is how to post something. And telling people that you didn't have to pay for it and you didn't have to buy a stamp, right? But that came out of an insight of just spending time with young people about a little change. And if we knew that if we could maximise the participation of young people and they could feel that it was easy, then the impact, the global impact would be driving up the youth vote, which would, we thought generally sway a yes vote. So I think that would be the other thing, which would be what are the small changes you can make that seem really achievable out of that?
You mentioned just then about talking to customers. Steve Jobs used to say, never, ever, under any circumstances, go and ask your customers what they want.
Yeah.
Get your best team of innovators together, your R&D engine, come up with a product, and then take it to them and see what they like.
Yeah.
Those who like it get to keep it. Those who don't like it, you take it away from them.
Yeah.
And go and give it to somebody else who likes it.
Yeah.
A very interesting process. Big companies, big organisations tend to go and, let's go and talk to our customers and find out what they want.
Yeah.
They will not tell you anything worthwhile.
Absolutely. And I'd agree with that, which is why I would say the other part of that is that Apple invest more in co-design than anyone else. They don't ask people what they want, they design it with them under a basis of some very simple principles. Make it simple, make it beautiful. So there are some things, you're right, where actually just running focus groups, for me, is completely ridiculous. Because if you think about it, I started my career in market research, enough, and they're like, they always had market research around toilet paper. And I was fascinated that people could spend an hour talking about toilet paper. But no one spends an hour thinking about toilet paper, right? It's an instantaneous decision. So when you're purchasing things, so I think that's right. If you over kind of cook these things, but actually what they did is put a product out there and adapt. That they learn from the experience of trying to put it out there as much as anything. But they do. And the other part of it is they are product led. So they have an idea, they have a thing that they put out into the world first, and then they go from there. Is an absolutely critical part, rather than just like, let's ask everybody. This has been our frustration. I've been on the advisory group for the government's kind of gateway, which I think fails every principle of good design, because they tried to meet the needs of everyone by asking everybody, and as a result, it doesn't meet the needs of anybody. So I think when you get this kind of the wrong way in the process, it absolutely you get the wrong outcome.
I gave a lecture to the Commonwealth Bank on as part of their agile development. You go out to customers and you ask them what they want. So 98% say we want this. There's 2% of really innovative thinking people say no, this is what we want. So you can imagine how difficult it is for a CEO of a big organisation to say, we're not going to do what 98% of our people want. We're going to do what 2% want.
Yeah.
Which is what they should actually do.
Yeah.
That's what the Liberal Party might do. We don't know.
Yeah. I think the other thing, which is definitely connected to that, is people can't deal with complexity internally as well. As I did a great leadership course at Stanford, and one of the biggest takeaways for me is that people can only really absorb 3 things. And that it has to then give them the freedom to know how to execute that. And it's something that we've taken into our organisation of every strategic plan basically is has no more than 3 words at its core, and the 3 words we repeat obsessively. So in this one, it's integration. We need to integrate retail and mental health system. It's innovation. We need to change the identity to serve more people, and it's scale. We need to help more people to get it done. And the idea is that by having that, you repeat it obsessively, and people are willing to understand it. I think in a lot of these cases, it's like I've got 50 KPIs and I'm overwhelmed and I don't know what's the most important thing. And I think again, go back to the Apple example of they were just obsessive about doing less. I think they only ever had 3 product lines, but they do them very well, and so it gives everybody a sense that they come into work with a great degree of certainty that the big things won't change. So that'd be probably the other kind of challenge out of this, as you guys are a relatively big organisation. What are the 3 things that people go, yeah, that's what we care about? That, you know, for us, it's about scale. Like, how do we get more people using our service? So when someone comes back with an idea about scale, they know that it's already pre-approved. How we execute that scale then is an interesting scenario.
Other comments? Okay, well, we might finish the formal part, and people might have time to linger and chat. I guess having the final word, I would note that one of our values is courage, and so this is perhaps the value that we can take forward and hold in mind, at least for the rest of the day, the rest of the week, possibly the rest of the year into next. So because we have to sort of flesh out what sort of courage we're going to have, and that will emerge in the months ahead. The leadership team will be focused on that a lot. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, everybody.